Welcome to Donuts and Bikes, the mountain bike coaching podcast. Your hosts are Paul Howard and Christian Jackson, and we're here to discuss the skills, techniques, and concepts we've used over the last 20 years to improve your riding or coaching. Enjoy the show. But no, it was all good. Smooth flight and back in the snow, back snowboarding. Yeah, it's great. It's good to be back, man. How are you? How's life with you? And
yeah, holidays were great. It's been this interesting winter here for us here in Boone, in Western North Carolina. We had an initial cold snap and a lot of good winter sports activities, and now it's been kind of up and down, warm and rain. So it's kind of hard to get in a sort of pattern, but making the most of it and having some fun where we can, and been enjoying some rare January mountain bike riding for us, which has been here in the mountains, which has been super fun. For sure.
That's cool. Yeah, I'm kind of keen to get back on the bike. I was doing a bunch of road riding in Byron Bay, and I just kind of want to keep going. And so we might go down to Bellingham and go see the transition team down there. Maybe go for some pedals in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, should we have a quick chat about that last episode, how to learn, and maybe get on with today's topic, cornering?
Absolutely.
Any takeaways or thoughts you got from that last episode we did?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that discussion, and some highlights for me were the ideas of pros and cons, and really digging into that. We've talked about that quite often over the years, but really getting a chance to take a deep dive into the benefits of approaching the learning, taking any skill and learning it in the sense of the pros and cons as opposed to absolutes. How about you?
Yeah, and I think that was the same thing for me. And I guess my takeaway too was that I think we're getting a little bit better at doing this podcast thing, because as our listeners are probably aware, we're just sort of winging it and figuring it out. But I feel like we're beginning to find our stride with it. And it's funny how you listen to people do podcasts and you're like, yeah, that's really easy. I'll just do that. And then you start doing it and you're like, oh, actually there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye. So that was for me, was my takeaway. I enjoyed listening to it back, and just, I think we're beginning to find our feet a little bit. And I think it's a nice segue for what we're talking about today with cornering, is some of those pros and cons concepts and kind of absolutes. I'm sure we're going to bring some of those out again today as we dig into cornering. So maybe we'll jump into today. And do you want to just start off with letting our listeners know kind of what's the topic for today, and we'll jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So today we are going to take on the subject of cornering, which is a very interesting concept and long debated in lots of places. And the approach to this conversation is going to start with kind of an understanding of what are some of the current concepts and perhaps even myths out there about cornering in terms of a mountain bike skill and in terms of coaching this skill as well. And so we're going to dive into that first, and then kind of transition that conversation into how we actually would teach some of these concepts with cornering.
Cool.
Yeah,
that sounds good. I always like to start with, what do people already know? What's the info out there? And from that, usually there's some myths. And yeah, I'd love to dig into some of those before we tell our listeners, some awesome recipes. That's going to be the goal towards the end of the podcast. Christian and I are basically going to pick one or two cornering progressions each, and we'll take our listeners through those. So hopefully you can go away this week and get more rad as you go around corners. Cool.
Yeah.
Where should we start with some of these myths? I know you've got a few notes here as we prepared for the podcast.
Yeah, I did a bit of a literature review of sorts here in preparation for this to kind of see what is commonly out there. And the YouTube is a go-to for lots of things, as we've talked about in the past. And there's no shortage of content on mountain bike instruction and cornering. If you do a quick search on cornering, the list of videos about this is quite long. And what this tells me is as a coach is that there's probably a lot to it. If there's 10, 12, 15 different people, including professionals that are out there giving tips, how-tos, demonstrations on this, that there's probably a lot going on with it. And with one quick glance from my point of view, just picked a handful of these just to kind of look for some themes. What are some themes that we're seeing that are out there, and then we're going to unpack those so that we can get more precise with them. So, just picking a random place to start with this, there's a lot of discussion about foot position. Paul, have you seen foot position as a topic for cornering before?
Wow, you're jumping into the deep end right off the start.
Right,
Boom.
we're just going right in.
Yeah. But foot position is the classic, can of worms. And I think some of the information out there, like we've seen, is I think what we see is the idea of communicating how do you ride through corners from almost an absolute mindset. So foot position is a classic one where you'll hear a coach or maybe on a YouTube say you got to keep your pedals level in all corners, or they'll say you can't drop your pedal to 6 o'clock because it stands the bike up. Or you'll have another coach which says you should drop your pedals to 6 o'clock on every corner, your outside pedal to 6 o'clock on every corner. And ultimately, when you go down that road of teaching absolutes, you're going to create myths, because one coach will say keep it level, another coach will say drop the outside pedal to 6 o'clock. And so now some riders will feel like, one of these is right, one of these is wrong. And this is where we start to come up with some of these myths. And it's purely just based from they're approaching the coaching or the communicating of technique with this sort of absolute mindset, rather than coming in and just thinking, what are the pros and cons? Because the reality is any good rider can ride through corners with their pedals level. There'll be pros and cons, and they can drop the outside pedal to 6 o'clock. There's going to be pros and cons, and they can actually feather it anywhere in between.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram @donutsandbikes, or at our podcast, the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast.buzzsprout.com. And now back to the show.
One of the common things I often talk about is how much you drop your outside pedal is relative to how much you separate the angle of the bike, how much you lean the bike underneath you. So the more separation there is, the more you're kind of leaning the bike relative to the body, the more the rider can, if they want, drop the outside pedal. So straight away, I think that's a hot topic, foot position. I think one of the, I guess for me is, and you've probably seen it, is people get so, they kind of get the blinders on and they just get into this concept of foot position, and they think foot position is this huge technique that's going to really impact their cornering. And then they kind of forget some of the more fundamental things, like what's their body position like on the bike? What's their line choice? What are their braking zones? So a lot of the time I'll just get my riders to more or less choose a foot position, whatever they're most comfortable with at the time. If they're comfortable keeping it level, let's just stick to that.
Well, I think
if they're comfortable dropping the outside pedal, let's stick to that. But then let's work on their body position because their weight's back, or let's work on their line choice because their line choice, they're not opening up the start of the turn and rounding out the turn. There's like these more fundamental basic things that if we just focus on that, they'll get way more out of their cornering. But yeah, what are your sort of experiences with foot position?
Yeah, but as you're speaking there, it made me remember back to this is the last episode, then how to learn. I think it's a bit human nature to want to latch onto something like foot position as a shortcut to improving, to improvement, right? To get better at cornering. It can come down to one or two things. If I figure out this whole foot position myth, it's going to make me better. And in reality, as you're saying there, it's a bit of a shortcut, right? Because it's not just one thing. The position where, whether it's 6, 12 or level or whatever it is, impacts a whole bunch of other things as well. And so if we're just understanding the one piece of it, then we're not going to be able then to apply these skills to different situations, different kinds of turns, different speeds, and so on. So it's kind of made me think there of the really, for us, there really aren't shortcuts or magic solutions to we're going to get better by doing just this one thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because that's, if you think of like your foot position or your pedal position, however you want to label it, but it's so tempting, right? If you want to get better, and there's this concept of, I can keep my pedals level or I can drop my outside pedal. That seems easy. I can just swap my pedal position. It's like, it seems like this low hanging fruit, but really it's not. And it kind of reminds me too, like the switch feet is another one that you'll hear is not that often, but occasionally it pops up. I know there was one coach that was quite ambidextrous, and they were quite good at riding switch feet. And then they've trained a lot of other coaches this tool to pass on to their riders. Like, because if you're riding pedals fairly level and your right foot is your back foot, so your front foot is your left foot, your hips are going to be rotated slightly to the right. So it's going to actually help you with those right-hand turns. So the logic is, if I then swap my feet and switch them up, so now my right foot becomes my front foot and my left foot becomes my back foot, my hip's going to be slightly rotated to the left, and that should help my left-hand turn. So if you're an ambidextrous person, rider, and you can ride switch foot fairly easily, biomechanically, this is a good example where biomechanically this kind of makes sense. Like the theory makes sense, but we're often reminding riders and coaches that there's ideal versus real. There's kind of the theory versus the practice. And in reality, in the real world, most people, when you ride switch foot, biomechanically, they might have that advantage, but it just feels so awkward that the reality doesn't match the theory. And then you get all these riders trying to, I think the other one too is if there's linked corners. If you've got one isolated turn, you could argue that maybe switching the foot position could set them up from a position and a rotation standpoint better for that turn if it's an isolated turn. But if you suddenly got linked turns where one turn flows straight into another, trying to switch your pedal position between those turns is A, it's really difficult, but B, it's kind of dangerous. So again, it's just the coach hasn't quite thought like, oh, I'm ambidextrous, this feels good for me, but does that always translate to every rider that you're teaching? And it was interesting, I was watching that Santa Cruz video the other day. There was a podcast just a couple of days ago. And I think one of the questions was, do you ride switch foot? And every single one of them, like Petey, Nina, Jackson, like all of them, Greg, Laurie, were like, nope, it's silly. It feels awkward. And to me, that says a lot. You got the best riders in the world, and they're like, I never switch my feet. And again, that's not an absolute. Just because they don't do it doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily help the average rider. But again, I think the conversation becomes, almost a little bit more argumentative when you go down the road of like, you have to try this switch foot thing, rather than, well, here's really, I would class the switch foot thing as not a technique, but a tactic. And I think as people learn about how do I corner, they come into something, whether it's a lesson with a coach or maybe they're researching on YouTube, try and separate what is a technique versus what is a tactic. And riding switch feet is a good example of that's not a technique. That is a tactic you can apply to help you learn some things, to feel some things, but it's not necessarily something you need to do when you're actually just riding normally. And especially when you're trying to ride fast with performance. So, I don't know how would you sort of relate to that in terms of as we go through some of these myths and trying to separate what's a technique versus what's a tactic.
Absolutely. I think that you're right. You're spot on here with, the actual skill, the practice of the skill versus when and how much you do it, and into what specific purpose are you doing it. When I was training for,
do you ride switch foot?
Well, I was going to say when I was training for Gravity Nationals in the U.S. many years ago, somebody convinced me to try switch in turns, and so constantly putting my lead foot on the outside for the turn, and it was terrible. It was an just absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
It's just like there's too much to think about. The actual the benefits of that were not nearly as good as I was led to believe, by Hammer who told me. But
it's funny for me. It's funny for me because from a snowboard world, having coached snowboarding for a long time now, like nearly 20 years, like we spend a lot of time teaching and riding switch because it is so good for your snowboarding. But at the same time, it's a completely different piece of equipment. It's actually made, the snowboard is literally made to ride both ways. So it's kind of in that context, it's kind of different. Like you're supposed to ride switch because you actually need it for certain tricks, and it's great skill development. But I think the other reason why as snowboard coaches we ride switch is biomechanically it helps balance out our movement patterns and the use of our muscles. So there are sometimes if I'm coaching like long days or a lot of days in the bike park, I might start riding switch purely as a way to make sure that my body is the wear and tear is a little bit more even on my body. I think even PT said that in the Syndicate podcast. He was like, if there's long runs, he might ride switch for a little bit just to help balance out, the fatigue in the legs or the back leg. But yeah, again, it's really it's a classic example of sometimes the coach or the person making the YouTube videos is getting a bit confused between how do we actually corner versus what's a technique or what's a tactic to just feel something fun that we don't have to do in every turn. Maybe let's chat about the classic, berms, we lean with the bike, and then flat corners, we separate and we lean the bike underneath us. So this stuff's common. It's out there. What are some thoughts from you? Like, is this a myth? What do you think?
No. It's real. Okay. It's real. These are real for sure, and there are myths as well. So what's interesting about this, and it ties back into foot position, is if we're trying to train our riders to be more effective in corners, it's not just one thing, right? It's not one thing that's going to. One thing we may see an improvement. It may feel better, but there's a lot going on here that we need to address. And one of the shortcuts, again, back to the shortcuts idea, is if we peruse the literature, so to speak, we'll see you lean with the bike in berms. Right, that's when there's a berm coming up. We're going to inclinate. We're going to lean the body with the bike, and for a flat turn, we need to engage in some sort of bike body separation, or we need to angulate, lean the bike more than the body. And when we operate simply from those two perspectives, and we're training riders to then basically copy paste berms coming up, I need to lean with the bike, right? Versus the idea like, well, each berm is a little bit different. What's the surface like? How steep is the actual bank? What's the shape of it? Is it a closing radius, or is it a uniform radius? How steep is it? All of these things are going to then translate then into movement of our bike and our body, that's what we really need to be working on with our riders in these with angulation and inclination. It's about movement. We're moving with the bike, moving moving the bike more than the body.
Should we just quickly just define those terms, because you hear those terms in the coaching world a little bit more often, but inclination versus angulation. So inclination is
you're leaning the bike and body together.
Yeah, and then angulation is
leaning the body, or leaning the bike more than the body. So the body stays more in line with the direction of gravity. And then inclination.
Yeah, I like angulation is that for me, it's like you're creating angle between you and the bike.
Right. And again, we get into, we see shortcuts there of angulation as one thing. Like we have to think, well, how many degrees are in an angle? It's like how and then depending on what we're trying to achieve, that angle becomes less of an angle or more of an angle. And there's certain things that we're doing with our body then to create and make that happen.
Yeah. So there's all these like hows, right? Like how to corner, but sometimes people, I think they kind of forget. I wouldn't say forget, but I think what doesn't get a light shone on it as brightly as it should be is what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve in a corner? Like for me, the biggest outcomes we're trying to get in the corners are stability and grip, and then adjustability. So if I just rearrange those, so stability, adjustability, and grip. So for me, it's a bit of an acronym, but I'm always looking for sag through corners, not sag in my suspension, but stability. If the rider is strong and stable, they're going to feel more confident. They're going to be less on the brakes. They're going to be happy to carry speed. If they're strong and stable, they can do stuff. They can pump, they can push, they can tip the bike. They can do things if you're in a strong and stable position. Adjustability and those kind of two go hand in hand. If you're strong and stable, you can move the bike underneath you. You have that ability to finesse and tip the bike a little more, lean it over a little bit more, maybe bring it back up if it starts to slide, maybe more control over how much you're leaning your body. Like I can tip in a bit more. I can kind of make myself come out of the corner and come more upright. So stability and adjustability, they really go hand in hand together. And usually the outcome of those two means the rider can maximize and control the grip through the corner, and good stability, adjustability, and grip, or good sag through the corner, usually relates to just consistent speed. Like they can maintain, people often talk about going faster through corners, but a good place to start is not trying to accelerate or go faster through corners, but just carry the speed that you have. So you're just trying to slow down less rather than trying to go faster or trying to speed up. The first goal for any rider in their cornering is just to minimize how much you slow down through the corner and maximize how much speed you can carry. So when I think of those outcomes and I look at like how-to videos, often they're really focused on the how, the body position, the braking point, the line choice, the leaning the bike, the leaning the body. But they kind of gloss over some of those outcomes. And I think for me, like when we look at some of these, berms, you lean with the bike, flat corners, you lean the bike underneath you. For me, that message becomes a myth, because the reality is you actually do both in every corner. Like every flat corner, there is some degree of leaning with the bike and some degree of leaning the bike underneath you. And it's the same in a berm. Like there's some degree of angulation, leaning the bike underneath you in most berms. One of the common things I'll give my instructors or riders that I'm working with is as soon as I feel like the bike needs to be on the side knobs of the tires, there's some degree of angulation. And if you think of flat corners, pretty much every flat corner, there's going to be angulation because it's going to be engaging those side knobs. But if you think of berms, like unless the like you said, unless the steepness and the radius of the berm is matched perfectly with the rider's speed, chances are the bike will need to be leaned enough to get onto those side knobs. So even in a berm, there's going to be some degree of angulation. Like in the whole of Whistler Bike Park, I can probably think of like a handful of berms. I mean, how many berms are in Whistler Bike Park? Like, I don't know.
All of them.
500? Yeah. All of the berms are in Whistler Bike Park. There's so many berms. I could probably think of like 4 or 5 berms maybe where I can literally just tip in and have no angulation and literally just lean with the bike all the way through the berm and really have very little to no separation through the berm. But even then, I think about it like initiating the turn or finishing the turn. There's probably some degree of separation there as I start or finish the turn. So I think that's a nice place to start with that content that's out there. Like berms, you lean with the bike. Flat corners, you lean the bike underneath you. Again, don't look for those shortcuts. Try and think of things as not absolutes, but really every corner is a long recipe of lots of skills involved. And then each specific corner, you're just changing when and how much you do each of those things, rather than this corner is A, B, C, and then this corner is A, D, E. It really, every corner has all of them. It's just how much and when do you use each one based on the specific type of corner.
Yeah. So to connect some dots here in this first part, the main takeaway I have about these myths, the overarching theme is that a lot of the myths approach cornering as a recipe. If you put these ingredients together in this order, you're going to be better at cornering. And when I bring this back to your idea of technique versus tactic, I'd like to layer in, this idea that it's, tactic is something that you're doing for a specific outcome. The outcome we're talking about is stability, adjustability, and grit. Right. That's what we're going after. That's what we're trying to achieve. That's the outcome of whatever that we're doing. And as coaches, then we step back and we say, what are the techniques to achieve that? Right. So angulation becomes a skill set to achieve this. Inclination becomes a skill set. Rotation, which we haven't talked about yet. Our trail scanning, our position, all these things become the ingredients then that we can train our riders towards, right? So they can become proficient at the tactic. And then ideally, as you were talking, I was thinking about we want to be able to, as a rider, translate those tactics and those techniques to a variety of situations. And I was as I was sharing with you earlier, that I was riding this morning on a very narrow, slightly off camber trail that was a bit technical, and I was riding in a straight, like the trail was straight, but I was having to rotate it a lot to keep my line straight, right? So I'm using the technique of rotation, or the skill of rotation, to really maintain a line. And again, that's back to the mythology around this, is that, well, you just rotate, for what, flat turns or whatever. It's like, well, if you can unpack those skills, then they're going to be applicable in lots of different scenarios.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, that's that's, you know, in the PMBIA, just to jump into that real quick, like the fourth skill is, we call it direction control and not cornering, because exactly why you've just kind of highlighted is, you know, if you think of the term direction control, other things can fit in there that aren't necessarily cornering per se, you know, like you said, like trying to hold a line, maintain a straight line on some off-camber terrain. Like you're leaning the bike, like you said, you're twisting your hips, you're doing all the things that classically you would do in a corner, but your goal is different at that point. Your goal is to try and stay in a straight line, right? So I love that. And that just highlights the importance of riders really trying to think of when you're trying to improve your cornering, rather than going down that road of like, this is how I corner, this is how you do it. Try and separate, like, how do we corner? How do we do this versus how do we learn this? And a lot of the YouTube videos and content out there, they're quite good at like listing off how do we corner. I always remember like there was a pretty famous pro rider. He did a YouTube video of how to corner a few years ago, and it was actually really good. Like content was good, but it was like the takeaway from the video was like 8 things to think about in your cornering, and it was all good. You know, it was like line choice, braking zone, leaning in, twisting the hips, pushing, pumping in the berm if it's a bit of a berm. Like it was all really good info, but again, they hadn't quite understood, like, yes, that's how we do it. Those are all the ingredients that we apply through a corner, but that's not how we learn it. You know, how we learn it is we take one of those skills, one of those components, and we build a progression just around that one thing. So trying to just put a line there between how do we do it versus how do we learn it. And I guess when you talk about some of these techniques versus tactics is that's what helps, I think, riders improve their cornering more effectively or more quickly, is when they understand that any technique in the list of ingredients can essentially be developed everywhere. It doesn't have to be only cornering, that you work on your hip rotation or your body position or your braking points. Like these are all skills that you can apply and develop everywhere on the trails and not just in the corners. And if you can kind of think of it and approach it that way, you can work on your cornering when you're not cornering.
Yeah, for sure. And I maybe think about the phrase we use in PMBIA, the mobile athletic rider, right? You know, and just somebody that has a wide range of movement, you know, good patterns, and taking this idea of how to do something versus how we teach it versus how we learn it backwards a bit. Another piece here with the myth is, how do we know as coaches our riders are ready to start angulating, inclinating, rotating? You know, and we need to look back and see, you know, are they mobile? Is there mobility in their riding? Do they have a range of movement? And it may be that in a cornering lesson, maybe we're not cornering at all. Maybe we're working on simply moving the bike more than the body in a straight line. We're developing that movement in the 4 planes, so that they can then take that and be ready then to start angulating or inclinating, rotating.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah, totally. And we kind of I see that a lot. Like you'll get a student or a rider that's like, I want to improve my cornering. I mean, that's pretty much one of the most common lessons, right? Corners, jumps, drops. It's the sort of your classic intermediate mountain bike lesson. But and a lot of the time, you know what? The corners are actually making you focus too much or think too much. We actually just need to go ride a different trail over here and just work on your position balance, get you a little more centered, get you, like you said, like more mobile. You can actually move the bike underneath you without collapsing back or getting stiff, and really working on the rider's position and balance on the bike. And this is so common. Like, you know, the rider will want to learn A, but we actually and we assess them, we analyze them, and we look at all the skills. And actually, we need to go away and develop this core skill, and then bring it back to the cornering. And again, that's just another example of like, yeah, I can give you a list of all the things you need to do through a corner, but if you actually want to get better, we need to just pick one of those and analyze and develop and work on that skill. And you can do that in the corners, but you could do that outside of the corners as well.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe this is a good place to jump into a discussion on some lessons we might work on with riders.
Yeah.
As you were talking there, I was thinking, a common place to start with cornering once we're, as we've talked about, we're ready with the rider's ready and we're ready to teach cornering. One of the places I like to start is with position. And a common scenario that we see with many riders, especially with the advent of bike park type trails everywhere now, right? So there are berms, in our public lands here, the private bike parks, et cetera. They're very, very common these days, and everybody wants to get faster and better at berms. Common scenario we often see.
One little thing to interrupt. I thought of this T-shirt the other day. We could do a hashtag make flat corners great again.
Oh no.
because I love berms, but I feel sometimes I get to the point where I'm like, occasionally you'll be riding somewhere and there'll be like this really sweet flat corner and you'll be like, oh, that was beautiful. Like, I miss flat corners a little bit. I love berms. I'm happy about berms, but yeah, I thought of that the other day. So that hashtag me.
That
was great.
There's some great examples of some old school turns in this area. Canuga has a handful of some really awesome non-berm.
That's what's funny. That makes me feel old now because people are like, flat corners. Oh yeah, old school corners. And I'm like, how is that an old school corner? Isn't that just a corner? Like, but I guess they are, aren't they?
Well, but bike parks, bike park trails, big berms.
Yeah.
But anyway, but again, to the common scenarios here, and it's what fascinates me about this is it's translatable in so many areas, and the propensity of a rider in a berm to get in the back seat, and be subject to the forces and not even be aware of it, is ever present, with our riders. And so you're thinking about lessons around position in our starting in a bank turn or a berm, developing a lesson around how to be centered and to maintain that position throughout the radius of a berm, and really accelerate and start that learning progress towards being more effective in corners. So often we'll be able to demonstrate this from a perspective where the rider can watch me or you ride through the berm and actually see getting into the back seat and see what this biomechanically looks like. And then we can use that image as markers then to contrast with what it looks like to go through centered. And, use makers of chin over stem, low, wide, and centered, relatively low through the turn, and then get our riders to practice that and feel, kind of back to what we talked about with feedback last time, is, feel the feedback of what the difference is between being in the behind center and then being truly centered through this turn. And typically we're seeing good results with this. And as we progress this lesson, we can look at, when is it more appropriate to maybe be a little forward of center? I mean, what scenarios might that be useful? And then what we're doing then is really developing the rider's sense of position as a skill in this specific setting, and being able to adjust that position as needed based on speed, size, shape, et cetera, obstacles or whatever. So they're becoming a more competent and confident in that within that one specific skill set, right? And so we're not diving into foot position, not diving into braking, line choice. We're simply focusing in on this idea of position and developing this over the course of, an hour or even more, depending on what kind of training we've got.
Yeah.
And once we've got
that's a common one.
Yes, once we've got that,
Sorry, bud.
Yeah, no, once we've got that, that concept of position, then we can, dive into some of the other pieces of this as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I was just going to say, like, it's a common one when you have new coaches and newer coaches, and you kind of tell them, like, yeah, I can spend a whole day or a weekend just working on position and balance for cornering, that one skill. And they're like, how do you teach that for a whole weekend? Like, I could teach it for 2 weeks. I could take a rider and just develop their ability to move on top of the bike, move the bike underneath them, and control their position in different terrain, different scenarios. So the rider has ultimate control over their position on the bike to get more front wheel grip, back wheel grip, to be more centered, to be more stable. We really take that position and balance concept, that skill, you can develop that for a whole season, just that one skill. And straight away those newer coaches start to realize, like, there's a difference between how we do it versus how we teach it. And if we're going to teach it, we've got to break it down. We've got to pick one component. And ultimately, it takes a long time. If you're going to change someone's position and balance or add to it or develop it, it takes time. It takes time. So I think for the listeners out there, is like, patience is a good one. Like, if you want to improve your cornering, be patient with not only not working at three or four things at once, just pick one thing, but then be patient with working on that one thing for a longer time and seeing how much development and, in a way, how much juice you can squeeze out of that one skill before you move on to another skill or you add another element, I guess.
But yeah, as you're talking through that, it made me remember pros and cons and not absolutes. We can extend this idea of position, pros and cons of when might it be better to be a little back of center, so we're not just teaching the position, but we're trying to instill that idea of there aren't absolutes, but as soon as we have control over what we're doing over the bike or what the bike's doing under us, then we're going to be a more adaptable and confident rider.
Yeah, like a common one I often recommend, and I'll do this with my riders, is you might just have like an empty car park or a grassy field with good grip, and we'll just lay out some cones, and we'll just do some slaloms, and we'll start off, like you said, let's just get this centered position dialed. It's generally best to start the rider being more centered, so we get good grip over both wheels, especially the front wheel, because I always reminding my riders, like, the front wheel is the business end of the bike. It tells the rest of the bike where to go. So it needs grip, and we need to learn how to position ourselves on the bike. And to do that, a lot of the riders, because they're off the back, when you actually get them centered, they actually feel too far forward, but they're not. They're just not in the back seat. So there's almost like, take the train out of it, empty car parks and cone drills, and it's this really minimal environment that helps us squeeze more out of their techniques. We call it, touched on it before, but like minimum training, maximum technique development. Just get them comfortable with hinging at the waist, chin over stem, feeling like there's weight on the front of the bike, or there's fairly even weight on the front of the bike relative to the back of the bike. And once they're comfortable and confident weaving through cones centered, it's like you said, we don't want them to walk away thinking absolute, every corner I need to be centered. It's all about, the start of this corner is a little loose. The berm's not supported very well. I need a little extra front wheel grip. So let's see if in the cones, the car park drill, maybe we just get them to level the feet a little bit. That can be a tool. Sometimes if you drop the heels, it can just sort of squeeze the bike ahead of the rider slightly. And then if you level out the feet, it can almost tuck the bike back slightly. So maybe instead of the chin over the stem, the chin is maybe like just over the handlebars a little bit more, like 1 centimeter forward. So that tiny little adjustment, it just helps them feel that maybe instead of the weight being 50-50, maybe it's like 52% on the front, 48% on the back. They just got a slight bias to that front wheel, and it's just a starting point for them. Like, now we can feel what it's like to corner through those cones, have a little extra pressure and grip on the front end. And again, like you're saying, I'm just sort of highlighting, how do we take those concepts of centered, try it slightly forward, try it slightly back, but bring it into an environment safely where the student can develop their position and balance skills. And then on the trail, they can decide what they want to do. Do I want a little extra front wheel grip? Do I want to just be centered?
Well, I think, it's a good point there to remind our listeners that in any lesson, we're designing the lesson around specific goals. And the more clearly we can articulate those goals with the rider, then the more the learning process is going to progress. And here again, stability, adjustability, and grip. That's what we're trying to achieve through the position, in our cornering lessons here. And so as we're keeping languaging that, then we're expanding the lesson into not just a cookie cutter, the recipe, here's what you do in this turn. We're truly getting at this skill set here.
Yeah, totally. I think, and really that's where the coach comes in. I think that's one of the downsides of the YouTube videos is let's say take 10 riders, right? Like 10 riders will watch the same YouTube video on the 6 or 7 things you need to think about through a corner. Which obviously you can't do because you can't think that quickly through a corner. That's the other reason why we just work on one skill at a time. You can't really ride and think about more than one thing anyway. But anyways, you take those 10 riders, and chances are each one of those 10 riders might need a slightly different skill. Like rider 1 might actually need to work on their line choice. Their body position is pretty sweet. Rider 2 their body position's kind of horrible. They're just collapsed and stiff. We definitely need to work on body position for that rider. And then rider 3, they're really strong on the bike. They've got good body position, good line choice, but a little bit passive. They never really pump the berm. So actually that rider just needs to work on pressure control. So I think that's the other thing with the sort of YouTube videos is whoever you are, you'll take that information and you'll apply it, but you might not need half of it. You might only need one piece of it. And that's where this process of, how do we corner? How do riders go through corners versus how do we learn it? How do we learn it usually means each rider will actually have a slightly different skill to work on to improve their cornering. And it's not a case of just every rider working on the same lesson plan or the same recipe. Or even if they do have the same skill, maybe there's 2 riders both working on position and balance. They could be working on very different things. One rider might be collapsing back because when they get low, they bend their knees a lot and they don't hinge at the waist. And that's what causes them to collapse back. So they need to work on like keeping the legs a little stronger, bending the knees a little less, and hinging at the waist more to bring the shoulders down over the bars. So that could be rider A, but rider B, maybe they're really good and they're nice and centered. The chin's over the stem. They got these strong legs. They're not collapsing, but they just stay a bit too tall through the corner, given their speed and given the type of corner. They're just a bit too tall. So that rider, we're actually just working on getting them lower. So 2 different riders working on the same skill, but quite different biomechanics going on. And again, that's just another example of why we need to just pull out one of these ingredients and build a lesson around it, rather than people going off thinking, I'm going to try and I've got to brake here, then I've got to pick my line, then I've got to lean in and tip the bike and twist my hips, because it's just going to end up in overload and the brains are going to blow up.
Sometimes in my personal writing on that note, I'll pick something like angulation, and maybe I'm out for personal ride, and I'm just working on that one thing on the entire ride. Just kind of looking at like, how am I using this in various places? What are the outcomes of being more or less angulated here? And I think that kind of speaks to what you're talking about, is that we've got to be focusing in on one thing to see maximum results with our rider. And that highlights the need of us as coaches to have a very comprehensive view of the skills, of all the skills, how they work in concert with each other, and then being able to tease out the right ones at the right time to have the most impact on the rider.
Yeah, I love that. Like, the common one I see is, and you can see it if you're in a coaching program, if a coach is talking about 2 or 3, 4 different things in a cornering lesson, it's nearly always a sign that the coach doesn't understand each one of those 3 or 4 things deeply enough. So they can't build an entire lesson around one thing. If you have a pretty shallow understanding of one thing, you'll probably run out of material after 5-10 minutes, right? But if you have a really deep understanding of it, and different tools, biomechanics, drills, tactics, you can build a half hour, 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour lesson around that one skill. So that's something to look for if you are in a coaching program. A good coach can talk to you for a whole week about one skill, and then imagine how that translates to your progression as a rider with respect to that skill. It's going to be very impactful, rather than kind of glossing over 3 or 4 things and never actually developing any one of them. Cool. We talked a bunch about position. Are there any other kind of tactics or common flaws you see with that skill when you're teaching that through cornering?
Through position? Or the other skills, which...
Yeah, no, I was just thinking more like if you had any other bits of info with that skill of position before we kind of go on to another skill.
I think we can probably go on to something else.
Good.
Yeah.
Sweet. What about braking? That's a classic cornering component, right?
Yeah. Brake early and often, right?
Yeah. Brake before the corner and don't brake in the corner. That's the classic. That's a myth, right?
Yeah, I think if you were to run some sort of brake measurement device, which I think those are out there, and really watched maybe a World Cup racer through turns, there is to some degree some braking that's happening. Especially in the first half of a turn. Yeah,
absolutely. So the first thing, I'll go through maybe a little progression I kind of commonly go through with my students is like, the first thing I'll tell students is you're allowed to brake in the corner. So that myth of you can't brake in corners, we'll chuck that one in the bin. We can even use braking to our advantage sometimes in corners to create more grip. I know that sounds backwards, but there are some specific scenarios where we can fully go down that road. But straight away, I usually just start off with try to think of cornering and braking as I'm going to try and brake more in a straight line and less in a curve. It's the same on technical terrain. Try and brake more when it's smooth and less when it's rough. Because sometimes it's ideal versus real. The reality is it's very hard to completely not break through a corner or completely not break through a rock garden. We need some breaking. So that straight away puts some of my students at ease, because then they realize that maybe what they're doing previously isn't quote unquote bad. I think that's the other outcome when you teach absolutes or you teach kind of laundry lists of how to do something, is if the rider doesn't do that, then they think they're doing something bad. Whereas really that's not the case. So we start there, and again, I might just start on a fairly easy trail, green or a blue trail, or sometimes you can start on a slope if you have like a field somewhere with a slope, or maybe I was thinking like a car park on a slope, but there's no sloped car parks. It'd be good if they could build those, but generally they don't make them. They make most car parks flat, but that would kind of be ideal. But yeah, just a basic trail. And I'll just get my riders to practice braking 2-1-0. So both brakes before the corner, one brake through the corner, and then no brakes towards the exit. And recently I've moved more towards both back, none, especially when I'm teaching kids, as they connect with that quicker. And it's a little bit more prescriptive to the rider, so they don't get confused between the front brake or the back brake, or which one are they doing. So both brakes before, back brake through, and then releasing that back brake when they're comfortable and happy to let the bike go. And that's usually around the exit or just before the exit. So a good kind of explanation behind that, I tell my riders, is both brakes to slow down and then the back brake to not speed up. And straight away getting my riders to understand that these are two very different braking concepts. When I'm slowing down, there's quite a lot of weight transfer typically. The back gets light, the front gets heavy. That requires the rider to brace. If I'm bracing, it's harder to sort of move, lean the bike, steer. Hence, that's why I want to do the slowing down piece before the corner, because when I get to the corner, I want the wheels to be fairly evenly weighted. I want to be relaxed. I don't want to be bracing. I want to be able to move or steer or lean the bike. So it's just highlighting to them, slowing down is different to not speeding up. So we can hopefully get most of that slowing down done before the corner. And then especially in a downhill corner, and especially in a berm, the physics are when you go through a radius, there's usually an acceleration. That's just physics. You can feel it in a ski and a snowboard when you're carving, especially on a downhill slope. And especially for intermediate, novice intermediate, even sort of strong intermediate advanced riders, if they're not ready or used to that feeling of an acceleration through the berm, the bike will commonly kind of get away from them, right? It will get ahead of them, and then the rider will kind of get pushed or sucked into the back seat. So that little bit of back brake through the corner, it doesn't slow the bike down. It doesn't cause the front end to fold or take away any traction from the front end. But what it does do is it just helps keep the bike connected and underneath the rider, and it helps prevent that bike from accelerating away from the rider.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast. I hope you're enjoying this episode. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Be sure to tune in all the way to the end so you can hear the featured donut of the day.
When the rider gets better and more confident, you can kind of preempt that acceleration through your body position, through pressure control. And as you get more experience, more comfort, you'll be able to reduce that back braking through the corner to the point where often it's just both brakes before the corner, and then it is no brakes through the corner. But it's all about progression. So both back, none. And then over time, it could be both back even before the corner, and then none in the corner. So it's still a both back, none, but you're maybe just changing when and how much you do that progression of both back, none through the corners. So that's kind of the underlying technique. And then if you're listening to this at home, you can find a trail and just start practicing that through an easy berm trail. Or you can even do it if there's a slope, just with some cones. And you can even do it in a car park. It's just pedal, pick up a bunch of speed before some cones. You set out some corners with the cones and just practice some hard braking, drag the back brake through the corner, and then release when you're ready. And you can even practice it in a cone environment in a car park, purely to build that muscle memory of seeing the corner early, planning your both back, none braking zones early, and trying to visualize those braking zones. And again, if you've taken the terrain out of it, you can really dial into that execution of the skill. And it seems almost too simple, but a bit of mileage in a car park, in a field, on a really easy trail, maybe even on a type of pump track, depending on the pump track, you can get a feel for this both back, none progression, I guess.
That's awesome. I think, Paul, is in terms of maybe wrapping up a little bit here, these two ideas of focusing in a cornering lesson solely on braking, both back, none, 210, or position, as just two examples, right? So those are just two examples of how we might approach improving the cornering for our riders. Hopefully this is useful for our listeners in taking apart this idea of the myths around cornering, right? And so by focusing in on very specific things, doing some intentional training and structures around those things so we can see development is going to accelerate the learning for our riders. I think we could continue on. Yeah, totally. We could continue on with any of the skills, right? Same, with here's a progression for rotation, here's a progression for pressure, increasing pressure.
We could be here. We could literally do this all day. Have like a 6-hour podcast. What time are we at now? What are we up to? An hour?
Yeah, just a little over an hour. Yeah.
Can I squeeze in one more quick one with angulation?
Oh yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Real quick. Because I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this too. So when people want to learn how to lean their bike underneath them a little bit more, and usually that's happening because they're starting to corner with more speed, or they're starting to carry more speed through like linked corners. So it'll be like a left and then a right straight away. And you almost need that separation to sort of pick the bike up out of one corner and then tip it down into another corner to keep that flow going. Or they just want to look rad, because we all know those classic magazine cover shots, especially with PD back in the day. He was the master, this big, tall, lanky guy. And then all those amazing shots of him leaning that bike underneath him. It always looks so sweet. But there's kind of a thing I've been working on lately with just introducing riders to this feeling of separation and letting the bike tip underneath them. So what I've been doing lately is using steering. So again, in a car park or just a flat trail, and then we'll quickly take this onto the trail for our students so they can feel it, see it, and apply it on the trail. That's so important in coaching, is if you introduce something in a flat zone, take it to the trail so the student can actually apply it. But anyway, is we'll set up some cones in a straight line, and they're pretty close. And usually as a warm-up, what I'll get them to do is kind of ignore the cones, just go in a straight line and just feel some steering. So just steer quickly left to right. So stand in a nice, fairly neutral position, relaxed position on the bike, chin over stem, standing up. And just use the handlebars and get the front wheel basically weaving left to right fairly quickly. So we're not turning a lot. Like if you think of the turn corridor, it's a pretty narrow corridor. We're literally just going in a straight line and weaving the front wheel left to right and letting the handlebars steer. And what often happens is when you get the riders to do that, especially if they're relaxed and mobile, you can film them if you like, is you'll actually start to see the steering and just weaving and being relaxed and steering, is it actually starts to get the bike tipping left to right underneath them, which is the start of angulation. So then what I'll get them to do is try it through the cones, just to add a bit of a timing piece to it. And then sometimes we'll just spread the cones out, some more space between the cones. And now I actually get them to do a slightly bigger turn radius, so a slightly wider corridor. So if you think of an S as like your turn left to right or right to left, the S is kind of getting fatter and wider. And again, I'm still not talking about leaning the bike or extending the inside arm, bending the outside arm. It's just, let's use that steering and steer a little bit more to let the bike turn left or right. And again, they'll start to realize that the bike is actually leaning underneath them. So recently I've been talking more about, like, when you're introducing yourself or a student to angulation, depending on who's listening, if you're a coach that's listening or rider that's listening, is start with letting the bike tip underneath you before you start working on trying to tip the bike underneath you. What often happens with students, if they start with just trying to tip the bike underneath them and they're not letting the handlebars steer and turn left or right, is they'll often end up counterbalancing and not actually turning. So I'm just going to plant that seed with the listeners. If they've got any comments or questions, just feel free to reach out on our Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, and you can post some questions there. But just start with steering, letting the handlebars move left to right, letting the bike lean and tip underneath you from one side to the other. And then from there, you can naturally just add a little extra arm movement, add that little extension of the inside arm, bend the outside arm, just to increase the lean angle of the bike underneath you. But without the steering and without that mobility in the first place, it's always trickier to get that bike leaning happening, or angulation, if you like the techie term. I just wanted to touch on that. Somebody was asking me a question about that the other day, so I thought I'd squeeze that one in quick.
Well, I think you're onto something here, and a good example of this for people learning angulation is the conscious effort of trying to understand our movements, and the counterbalance supersedes letting the bike actually tip over. Right. And so you see this quite often when if a newer instructor is working with trying to teach angulation, and we're seeing a lot of counterbalance movements in the upper body, and it's probably a result of the conscious effort of trying to understand, is my one arm's long and one arm's short? Is there, what kind of angle are my elbows at? And as opposed to simply relaxing and letting the bike tip as a starting point. I think it's solid advice there, Paul.
Yeah, letting the bike tip, but also letting your body tip. Like, angulation isn't about this is probably another myth real quick, but it's not about keeping your body upright and letting the bike tip. Like, both of you are leaning. The body still tips slightly into the turn. It's just that the bike is leaning more than the rider. So that might just be another little myth to swap in at the end. Don't try and fight it and keep your shoulders or your body upright. You're still letting yourself naturally fall into the turn as much as you need. It's just you might happen to let the bike tip more, or try and tip the bike more underneath you if you need it based on your speed.
Well, I think that's a great place just to kind of highlight there and wrap up for us. In any given term, we're using many things, and even when we're angulating, there is a bit of inclination. There's probably a bit of rotation, and so on. And so again, back to the beginning of our conversation, it isn't just one thing: flat turn, angulation, berm, inclination. It's, there's a combination there. So hopefully we've really shined a light on that concept here in our conversation.
Yeah, dude, I love it. And I think the main thing for me, like the takeaway on this discussion, was that, like, it's understanding, like, why are some of these cornering myths out there, or where do they come from, and what are some of the pros and cons of some of the information out there. And for me, I think the biggest takeaway has been like, there's a difference between knowing how to do something and what are all the skills that are involved in every corner versus how do I learn this? Or if you're a coach, how do I teach this? And just making sure we draw a line between how we do something versus how we learn something. Excellent.
Well, Paul, this was fun. Enjoyed this conversation. A little different take on this on the podcast for us is taking one skill, talk about it. Look forward to taking on some more here in the future. Maybe we should do.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to do. I mean, we could do more cornering ones for sure. I feel like cornering is like you start talking about cornering or teaching cornering, and it's like going into a donut shop and you're only allowed to eat one donut when really you want to eat like 8 donuts.
But you probably
like,
shouldn't eat 8
I want to talk more about cornering because there's so many cool things to do with it. But well, I mean, what did we do? We did position breaking and some angulation. So that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a good place here.
Yeah, cool, man. Donuts? Do you have a donut of the day?
Kind of. Yeah.
Sounds ominous.
It's good. Yeah, good ending. But I was out for a ride, headed out of town the other day, and was going through a place that used to be a donut shop. Looking forward to getting a donut, and in its place, a cinnamon roll establishment had opened up. So naturally, I had to try the cinnamon roll, and it reminded me of a lot of your last donut, the crime scene donut, the jelly everywhere. This cinnamon roll had to weigh 2 pounds, but it was only like it was a small cinnamon roll, but it was just so dense and thick, and maybe had 3 or 4 inches of cream cheese icing on top. And I'm like, there's no way I should eat this whole thing in one go. And I took one bite. I'm like, oh, this doesn't stand a chance. I'm eating this whole thing. But it's just, yeah.
I am chowing down.
But just one of those cinnamon rolls is hot and light, but dense. Is just kind of magical for sure. But it wasn't a donut, so I'm going a little off script. I'll have to find some.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll let that one slip for this week.
Okay, good. Thanks.
We'll have to do better next week, but I think we can let that slip. A cinnamon roll is, I think, because of the sugar content, we'll let it in. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening to Donuts and Bike Podcast. Feel free to leave some comments for us if you got any questions or anything you want answered on the Instagram accounts. Be happy to have a conversation with you. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you next time.
Sounds great. See you, everyone.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and that it sparked some ideas for your writing and your coaching. As always, our approach to coaching is on pros and cons, not rights and wrongs. And with that in mind, our podcast is meant to be more of a conversation about topics and techniques rather than a final say in how to ride or how to teach. As always, please take care if using or applying any of the techniques discussed in this podcast. Stay safe, ride smart, and we'll see you next time.